All right, so one of the things we are finishing up, if you have the writings, Psalms, wisdom literature side, for our prophets, or on the back side, should say latter prophets. But we're finishing that up. One of the things that we've been discussing is this third section of Scripture, the Torah, the way the Jews set this up, was kind of all this prep work getting ready for the kingdom, the Messianic kingdom. And so a lot of your minor prophets are speaking of the day of the Lord, remember? And then the Psalms, Proverbs, Job, a lot of this is, okay, we've learned, right? We've learned from the Torah. We've learned from our mistakes. What can we do in waiting for the Messiah, right? And so a lot of these were read at Passover. A lot of these were read at feasts. A lot of these books, like Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, they were all read at certain feast days, and the emphasis was the messianic principles that are found in those books. And so it's actually why when you come to the New Testament, Jesus quotes a lot from these books because a lot of their major feasts, especially like Ruth was read a lot, Esther was read a lot. And so they are, they become these symbols for the Messiah coming and how he is going to protect his people, keep his people. And last week we kind of got into Daniel. That's where we were getting into Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah. These are the last three books in the Jewish Bible, okay? And so they work really well together because Daniel is living in exile. Ezra and Nehemiah is after exile. And then Chronicles, which at first would seem really weird to be the last book because it's almost like going backwards, because Chronicles covers a lot of what Samuel does and Kings does. It's an overlap, but the major emphasis is this new David coming, okay? So we're going to get there as we go, but if you have this, and you see how I have a transition statement after each one, in between each section. And the cool thing about this section, the transition statement, is always about somebody doing well or doing well for somebody else. And so it's cool because a lot of this was collected after the exile and put together after the exile for people who were living in exile or post-exile. Because remember, even after a lot of them returned back to Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity, a lot of them stayed in Babylon and lived there. Like Daniel never came back. And not all of them were obligated to, and they came back in stages. Like Ezra, even though Ezra is the beginning of the return, Ezra himself actually doesn't come back until 50 years after the first group comes back. So they come back in waves. And one of the things is they were told to go and do well for the city, right? That was the Jeremiah, to go. And so at the end of Job, you see the Lord restoring the fortunes of Job after he's lost everything. Now, once again, I believe Job was during the time of Abraham. And yet the Jews place it in wisdom literature, okay, and here near the end as truth. But once again, they're reorienting it, for a reason. And the ending of is God's going to restore the fortunes. And why would that be something the exiles would really, really want to end on a note in a book that they, put a lot of stock into, people who are living in exile? Well, if God can restore the fortunes of Job, then God can restore the fortunes of Israel. Okay, so a lot of these ends, and look at the end of Esther. For Mordecai, and once again, where did Esther live? Does anyone know where Esther lived? Esther lived in Susa, which is a Babylonian, Persian, because Persia conquers Babylon, right? Artaxerxes. And Esther lives under a Persian king. And so she's not even living in the land, and yet God is blessing Mordecai and Esther to the very last verses. For Mordecai, the Jew, was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. And once again, the book of Esther is all about these dispersed Jews who are living amongst foreigners. There are people who have not come back to Jerusalem. Okay? They're not living in Jerusalem. They're living in Babylon and Assyria and all these other places that have been scattered, and yet Mordecai was able to protect them. So God is even showing his protection even after, once again, it wasn't just for this 70-year period that God says, I'm going to, continue to be with you and bless you as a nation and bless you as a people. That even when they come back, and there are still people who are living off in these foreign countries who have not come back, God is still blessing and protecting and keeping them. And Haman, right? Haman wants to eradicate all of the Jews. Now, he's wanting to eradicate all the Jews that live in Babylon, Assyria, outside of Jerusalem. Well, God protects them. Remember the whole story of Esther and Mordecai. The end of Daniel. Who can summarize the life of Daniel? Or what are some things that Daniel has to go through? What kind of time period is he living at? Where is Daniel living during the book of Daniel? What's going on? Who's the king that he has to interpret dreams for? Well, it becomes Persia. Okay, so remember Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon. All right, we might need this timeline more than I thought. So right here, about 586 BC, Babylon comes and conquers Jerusalem. Now, stage one, they don't come and destroy everything. They conquer and they surround the city, and they take a bunch of the young nobles back to Babylon and basically raise them in the way of the Chaldeans. And Chaldeans just another name for Babylonians. And for 3 years they are trained, and Daniel is one of them. So he was a prince of Jerusalem, and he was probably 16 years old, and he's one of the captives who's taken back to Babylon. And he's under King Nebuchadnezzar. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar has his dreams, right? And Daniel interprets those dreams. Well, so Daniel's living in exile, okay? He lives through the entire 70 years of exile, and he never returns. He stays during the king of Persia, and then also there was the Medo-Persian Empire. So first it was the Medes, and then Persia kind of conquered, so it's kind of called the Medo-Persian Empire. So he lived under a Babylonian king, a king of Media, and a king of Persia, and all of them, each time, like Daniel in the lion's den is not Nebuchadnezzar. That's the king of Media. I know it's called Media, but it's Media, the Medo Empire. And then the next story that you have of Daniel is him working under a Persian king. And yet he rises in the ranks under the Babylonians, under the Medes, and under the Persians. And he stays there, and he's kind of an influence for the Jews while he's over there. Well, at the very end of the book of Daniel, the very last verse, it says, "Go your way till the end. You shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days." So God is promising Daniel, because of his faithfulness of living in exile and living among foreigners and foreign gods and remaining faithful, that God was going to bless him and that he was going to have a home with God forever. Now, why would a Jew, folk want that to be a focus of the end of that book? Same thing with Job, right? That God can restore their fortunes just because they sinned and they were sent into exile, that God still has a plan for them. God still desires for their future to be bright. And specifically what we're going to see is it's going to come through the line of the Messiah. The Messiah is going to be the king that kind of comes and brings us all together. Now we come to Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah is the most difficult books for me to really wrap my head around. And here's why. Ezra, not so much as Nehemiah, but both books end horribly. The end of Ezra ends with all of the people, the moment they come back, they build the temple, guess who they've started marrying again? I mean, it ends with them marrying foreign women, And Ezra is saying, you need to stop all of this. You need to get away from all these women. And that's how the book ends. Ezra condemns them for marrying foreign women. And Ezra's like pulling out his hair. Nehemiah ends after he builds the wall and he gets it all established. At the very end of Nehemiah, let's just go to Nehemiah. I want to read this last couple verses. And I want you to see what's going on. So Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, right? All right. I want to look at verse 23 of Nehemiah 13. So this is after Nehemiah's built the wall, and he looks out, and why did Nehemiah build the wall in the first place? Does anyone know why he would have built a wall?
Was it to keep people in?
It was to keep people out. It was for protection. It was to keep other foreign nations out. Well, in Nehemiah 13, when you read it, guess who's living in the walls? Just about every nation you can think of. They've let them in anyway. So we built these walls to protect and to keep people out, and we've invited them all in, which was kind of part of God's plan anyway, but that's a different story right now. But look at verse 23 of Nehemiah 13. Now, Nehemiah is normally, when you hear a seminar on leadership, Nehemiah is normally the star character, and they do like a character story of his life, but they never bring up this verse. Somebody read Nehemiah 13, 23 through 25.
Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Tasha, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other people, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage to your sons or their sons.
So, he's seeing some sin going on. What does he do? I beat them, I cursed them, and I pulled out their hair. Imagine that story. Imagine that scene and when you curse somebody, you were literally putting a curse on somebody, not like witchcraft putting on curse, but you could either give a blessing, like, a lot of times you would extend a blessing on somebody, or you would basically say, kind of like what happened with Eli and his sons, when they were living unfaithfully, God said, I'm going to curse your offspring, and so that your offspring will die. And so you would basically say, Tom, because of your sin, I am going to lay my hand on you, and as a representative of God, I'm going to curse you, and your offspring will fail for the rest of their life. It may or may not happen. I mean, you know what I'm saying? But that's what we're talking about. So he's walking around cursing people, not like swearing, ripping out their hair and beating them. And then here's what Nehemiah prays. Look at verse 29. Remember them, O my God, because they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Remember, all of these prophecies that we have read, remember Isaiah, Ezekiel, what was this new kingdom supposed to be like? New heart, new spirit, right? A new king, a new temple, a new people. It was going to be so exciting that even the Gentiles and the foreign people would come, and as Jews are going to the house of the Lord, they'd say, let us come and worship, with the children of Israel. So it was all these people who are coming together and worshiping God, and yet the two historical books that we have of post-exile are horrible. They both end with they're marrying foreign women, and Nehemiah is walking around beating, cursing, and pulling out people's hair. And he says they've desecrated the priesthood, they've desecrated the covenant, and they've desecrated the Levites. Verse 30, he says, thus I cleanse them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work. And I provided for the wood offering at the appointed times and for the firstfruits. Remember me, O God, for my good. So Nehemiah basically saying, they're worthless. Remember them for their desecration. Remember me for my good. Great leader, right? I see this as a very bad ending. And it is why you get the book of Malachi, where God comes and he's talking to the priests and he's talking to the leaders and he says, you guys might as well shut the temple gates. You might as well shut this down. You're giving lame sacrifices, lame animals. He talks to the priests. He says, the priests, you are marrying, you are taking the women who you married, the women of your youth, and you are committing adultery. You are not taking care of them. And God, right, that's where we get the verse, God hates divorce, right? God hates because he's put a part of his spirit in there. And then Malachi ends with, the day of the Lord is coming. Remember my law. Wait for the Elijah, right, the forerunner to come. And one day I will restore the heart. So we're at the same exact place here as we were here. And then, so what the Jews did, in my estimation, in my opinion, because once again, we have the breakdowns, but we got to ask ourselves, why did they do this? Why did they then put Chronicles? They have it oriented after Ezra and Nehemiah, even though it's events that take place. In the very end of Chronicles ends with a promise that Cyrus was going to rebuild the house of the Lord. And that's how the Jewish Bible ends, with a promise that there was going to be someone who would come and rebuild the house of the Lord. And if you know your history, you know Cyrus didn't. So what the Jews were anticipating was that nobody who had come yet was the Messiah, and the Messiah would be the fulfillment of that. Okay? And the cool thing is one of the things I talked about last week, is the very beginning of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, like the first 11 chapters, is all a genealogy. And guess how it's broken down? It's broken down from Abraham to Adam, or Adam to Abraham, Abraham to David, and then the rest of the story is David to captivity. Guess how Matthew's genealogy is broken down? It literally goes from Adam to Abraham, first chunk, Abraham to David, second chunk, and it makes a point. And then it goes from David, genealogy, specifically to captivity. It doesn't go past captivity. We've got all this genealogy that goes past captivity, but it specifically points out to captivity, right, and breaks it down in those three sections. It's the same exact breakdown that Chronicles. And what you're seeing is when Jesus walks on the scene, the way the Jews believe this story ended, still waiting for that Messianic kingdom, still waiting for that Messiah to come, Matthew is retelling the story saying, this is the fulfillment. This stuff, we're realizing we couldn't get it done. Jesus is the fulfillment of this, I will build my temple, son of David, son of Abraham, son of Adam. Okay?
What would constitute a foreign woman? Since Jesus had, 4 Gentile women in his genealogy?
Yeah.
I mean, who could they? Could they marry certain foreign women, or have to just be Jewish?
So here's one of those interesting conundrums, because they weren't allowed to marry foreign women. Okay? But when they do it with the spirit of like God and a humble heart, like with Ruth, Boaz sees her. Once again, she's already a part of the family. Because remember, Naomi, her husband and sons, they leave and they go to Cana, right? They're living in Cana and they get married, which they're not supposed to do. But when she comes back and she shows a heart that is exactly what God is looking for out of Israel, God allows her to be redeemed and added to the story. Same thing with Rahab, the harlot. She shows faith. Look at Tamar. She shows faith. And so you see these people who have the faith of what God is calling Israel to do. He has no problem adding them in. The problem that we see in Ezra and Nehemiah is they weren't just, as you just read, they weren't just marrying these foreign women and trying to make them Jews. They were taking on their language and their gods and their culture and their ways. And that's typically what happened. That is why God said to not marry, and his specific reason why he didn't want them to marry was because whoever they married, they would start becoming like those families. Now, if somebody wants to join the nation of Israel, right, what does Ruth tell Naomi? I want to serve you, but I also want to serve your God. That's different than going and marrying a foreign woman and going and serving her God. Okay? So they were pagans, right? So I think that's the distinction. The foreigners, if they're being redeemed and following God and proselyting and incorporating themselves into the nation of Israel, that's a different story than marrying them and then also bringing their altars and gods. And that's what you see in Kings, remember? That was the downfall of most kings, was they were bringing all these, well, where'd they get these foreign idols from? Well, they were marrying foreign people who brought their idols with them, and they were allowing them into the temple. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Now, and I am a strong believer. Not everybody would agree with this, and I want to make sure, because I brought it up last week, and I want you guys to just be aware. I am a strong believer that though God blessed Nehemiah in building the wall, he was not supposed to build the wall. Because remember, Zechariah and Haggai were sent before Nehemiah. Zechariah specifically tells them in Zechariah chapter 2 that, okay, I'm going to encourage you to rebuild the temple. Somebody's going to come and they're going to start measuring walls. Stop them. Don't let them build walls, because I am now going to be your wall. I'm going to be a wall of fire around the temple. I will be your protector. Do you trust me? Do you trust that I will protect you as a people? And what he desires at the end of Zechariah chapter 2, he says, because I want all of these foreign people coming in and incorporating themselves into the nation of Israel. And as they expand, what can physical walls expand? No, but can God, as being their protector, expand? Right? It's a whole lot easier. And God says, do you trust that I will protect you? You don't need walls. So Nehemiah comes in and he finds out that there's no walls, and he's brokenhearted. Well, part of it, if you've read Zechariah, God kind of planned for no walls. That's my opinion. Now, some people don't take that. But I kind of chalk it up to God allows humans to do their thing, but if they're doing it in faith, sometimes he blesses them. Like with David wanting to build the house of God. God says, I never told you to build me a house. I was going to build you a house. But since you asked, you can make the plans and I'll let your son do it. So, all right. So that's how the Jewish story ends, and I believe it is a beautiful ending. If you've read this and then you read Matthew immediately after, you're kind of going, oh, I see what Matthew's doing with his genealogy. Jesus is the thing that everybody's been missing here. Okay, Jesus is that Messiah. This is a new kingdom, a new kind of kingdom. And then guess what Matthew does with Jesus? He puts him back here into the story of Israel, takes him through his wilderness wandering, baptizes him right into the water, takes his spirit into the wilderness, defeats Satan. Right? He goes through and he quotes major parts of the story of Exodus and Deuteronomy to show where Israel failed, I will not. Where Israel failed, I will not. Okay? So any questions on that kind of setup? What I've told James and Marissa that when I'm done with the New Testament, all these sheets that I've been handing out, I've been compiling into one document. And even the beginning, my intro into the Bible, hopefully you guys will get a one big document that will help you. So when you're reading through your Old Testament, you're reading through some of these stories, these are things you want to be looking for. Because one of the things that I've come to realize is nobody here is going to be an expert in the book of Ezekiel. Okay? It's a hard book to read. And so no one's going to be an expert in the book of Jeremiah. There are parts of Jeremiah that are easy to understand, and then sometimes you're reading in Jeremiah, you're going, what in the world is going on? Same with Isaiah. And if you can follow these key parts of the story and kind of allow the middle stuff to just realize that he's speaking to a specific people about specific things they're going on in their life, and yes, it's like I was telling you, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, it's a combination of their sermons over 40 or 50 years. And so that's why sometimes you're getting the same thing. Like, I just read this. It's just recycling. Well, it may have been 2 years in between, but somebody compiled it and put it together. Okay? But your major part of the story is Isaiah is pushing forward the identity of the Messiah, who he'd be. He'd be God, right? There'd be a child coming in. He'd have the Spirit of the Lord. He'd be a suffering servant. So you're starting to get identifying marks of the Messiah. Jeremiah's big thing is he's not so much focused on the Messiah as in what the Messiah will do to his people. New spirit, new heart, new covenant, okay? And Ezekiel really focuses on God is unconcerned about location. God's Spirit can move anywhere it desires and wills and will be with his people wherever they are. And that starts the framework for Jesus' ministry, especially like in John 4, where he says there's no longer a mountain in which you'll have to worship. God is spirit. Those who worship him in spirit and truth, right? That's what God is looking for. And so all of these precedents are found in the Old Testament. And then you read part 3, and Psalms, Proverbs, Job is a beautiful, if we could actually live this out, this is what it would look like. And it would look beautiful. It would look great. Like the book of Psalms is the ideal David, right? The ideal exile. And the cool thing is those books set up another precedent that is Israel ever going to form a nation where it's just a bunch of Christians living together again? Where would the people of God live when the new Messiah would come? They'd be scattered, wouldn't they? They'd live everywhere. And so they have to learn to live as exiles no matter where they go. That's why the entire 3rd section of the Jewish Bible is all about how to live in exile and how not to live in exile. It's the truth of how the law ought to be lived when you're not living in the most ideal circumstances. That's why us as Christians in America, we have really been babied for probably the last 100 years. Because we've lived in a Christian nation, we haven't really had to go to Daniel and go, okay, what does it look like when your king is asking you to bow down to a foreign god and he's going to kill you if you don't? Well, go over to Islam, right? Go over to China. Go over to places in India, right? They are suffering that. So those stories are key for them. And so when Jesus comes and says certain things, you know, when you have these Old Testament stories, they're really helpful in understanding what the nature of the kingdom is. It was never meant to form a Christian nation where we just kind of were all, it really didn't work. And in my opinion, and I'll throw this out there, I believe the more Christian a nation is, the more divisions that come in Christianity. Where is more division in Christianity than anywhere else in the world? United States of America. Why? Because there's nothing that costs us to be a Christian. So we can create our own flavor of Christianity. Every time someone gets mad, they go start a new church. And every time someone believes something different, they go start a new church. But imagine if you were living in a society that hated you and that were trying to kill you and persecute you, and it wasn't something you could just start a new church everywhere you went. There'd be core teachings that you'd be concerned about. What you believed about the afterlife, and what you believed about, some of the things that we get in theological debates on, theologians who sit with their cigars and, they're old theologians, they've got these, cigars and their bourbon glasses, and they're sitting up on these podiums arguing with each other about, why did God create the world? There are Christians living in a country, they don't have time to debate that. They're trying to survive. What are the core teachings and tenets that Jesus gives for these people to survive?
I don't normally comment on Facebook towards religious things, but this is a group that I'm in of all Church of Christ women and mothers, and there were people on there the other day getting up in arms and offended that churches were changing times of service
for Christmas.
And I'm like, we have to be careful saying, like, some people were on there saying, why would we change worship based upon that? And I said, well, you have to be careful making assumptions that just because somebody pushes their service from 10 to 1 or 4 or whatever, that they're not prioritizing worship. I said, some places have more people out of town, some people travel, blah, blah. I mean,
there was
things that people fight about. I'm
yes.
just like, okay.
I saw a person who did mission work for like 30 years, and he was over in China for many of it. He goes, we met every Sunday at a different location and a different time just to keep the Chinese police off our back. He goes, now that was for a different reason. He goes, but we have got, it's kind of like last week when we kind of put the Lord's Supper after the sermon. Sometimes you need to change those things up just so people realize that, like the traditions that the 2-song prayer, and the moment you throw that off, like people go, is this even God? Like, is this even allowed? I mean, I was asked that. Is this even allowed? And you go, the fact that we're asking those questions, that is this even, and once again, a lot of it has to do with, and I don't blame people, but we live in a society that those are the things that we are concerned about when first of all, we don't even have a, like, order of worship found in Scripture, like how they did it, what they did. It probably looked a whole lot differently than what we do and how we do it. But the fact that those are the things that get us, like, our stomach, and there are people who legitimately go, I don't know if I can do that. And they're not like, I'm not trying to be mean towards them, but we have developed a tradition that if that ever changed, they think it's biblical. And like, that's not even in the Bible, but we don't even know those things. And in other countries, they're going, you guys are, it's kind of like what other countries look at our political scheme today. They laugh at us. And sometimes we get laughed at as American Christians, so we've got more Christians. But sometimes it's watered down because, I mean, what does it cost you to get here on Sunday morning to come worship? Gas money?
Deal with people like that was as you volunteer.
Yeah.
People at first.
Yeah.
This is the word we've always done.
Yeah.
This is the way it has to be. And it's not.
Yeah.
You talk about the Lord's Supper changing the time. Well, it just says do in remembrance of me. It doesn't say do in remembrance of me at noon.
Before, yeah, at noon. Well, and here's the thing. In Israel, we can learn a lot from Israel. When Israel was going through, when they were living in captivity, this is one of the things I'm telling you. When they were actually in captivity, they were closer to God than they ever been. Like Daniel is one of the few books, there is not one bad thing said against the people living in exile. Why? They didn't have time to argue about, hey, we're better than everybody. Oh, you're better than everybody, then why are you living as a captive in a foreign nation? But the moment they come back from captivity and they rebuild the temple and all that gold's there again and God's blessing them, what do they immediately do? Look how good we are. Look how much better we are than everybody else. And God goes, are you kidding me? All right, let's do it again. That's literally what the book of Judges is about. They get high off their haunches. God goes, okay, I'm going to let you. You think you're so good and you think you've done this by yourself? I'll step away for a moment. And what happens immediately? They get conquered. They get put into captivity. And they go, God, please bring us back. Okay, I'll send you a judge. Bring them back. The next generation, what do? The same thing, and it just happens over and over and over and over again. So sometimes we pray for no persecution, and we always pray for no molestation, but I wish we would change that word, like stop saying molestation. It's become something different than what it used to be, But that's another thing here or there. But sometimes a little pressure may help us, right? A little tribulation could probably be good for Christianity. All right. We finished Chronicles. We got into a little sermon. That's okay. I'm going to leave this up here on the board. Next week, we're going to follow this timeline. I'm going to show you how these things came in order. We're going to give an overall flow, and then we're going to be jumping right into the New Testament, breaking down the New Testament. And when we're done with the New Testament, I don't know what we're doing after that, so we'll see.